Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie Hasty. I am Vice President with SESCO Management Consultants, and we've been a partner with PHCC for many, many years to offer you all kind of HR consulting services. And what I'd like to talk to you today about is really making good hires, having solid processes in place that allow us to really identify our need, recruit well, source those candidates correctly, know what to look for in terms of resumes or applications, makes a good hire, and then the orientation, which is an extremely vital piece of screening and hiring. So that's going to be our process over the next 45 minutes or so, and then as Wayne said, what I'll do is go ahead and field the questions at the very end of the session if we have any, and hopefully we have enough time to answer those, but if not, certainly we will make sure that those answers, the Q&A, get answered via email and sent out to everybody. So as I mentioned, the entire process has quite a few steps involved. If we take the time to establish the process up front, it makes our job much, much easier in the long run. When you talk about making a hire and making a bad hire, rather, roughly 25% of that person's annual income is spent for having to train or to rescreen and rehire for that position if they're a bad egg. So we want to make sure that we're going through the process, we're utilizing appropriate tools and having good critical thinking through the process. And one way I do that is, first and foremost, by kind of looking at the job description for the position. I do encourage all of my employers, regardless of what industry they are in, to have a job description, even if it's an extremely basic, just laundry list of items and qualifications. That really is the starting point on how I develop my ad to be posted, what the qualifications and the experience level I'm looking for in my individuals. Job descriptions are also extremely important in the fact that they really establish our rationale for how we compensate folks. Are they going to be hourly or salaried exempt from overtime? How much, how many hours are they going to work? Are they going to be full-time, part-time? So that helps us not only from the screening and hiring standpoint, but also from Affordable Care Act. If we have some large employers, it also helps in terms of job descriptions with making reasonable accommodations under Americans with Disabilities Act, family medical leave, workers' comp. They're all extremely helpful from that respect. So it also allows us to use it as a screening and hiring tool from the standpoint of the new hire orientation. The job description does allow us to give employees a better understanding of the job when we present that to them and say, can you meet all of the requirements? Can you physically and emotionally and technically complete these duties? It also allows us to evaluate their job performance and using that as a performance management tool compared to what they're doing versus what they should be doing from management. So again, I encourage you to have a good job description. I like job descriptions because it also allows us to hire and place people where they are best suited. All too often, we'll get resumes or applications for folks that don't necessarily fit in for the role that they've applied for, but I may be able to use them in a different capacity. So if I have job descriptions for each position, I can look across the board and say, well, they don't fit necessarily in this role, but can I use them in a different managerial role or in an office role or out in the field with our clients doing the technical piece? They can help us forecast the training needs for a particular function, and most importantly, it outlines what I call our essential and non-essential functions of the job. The physical piece, the environmental piece, the requirements to do the essential duties. Especially for workers' comp purposes and Americans with Disabilities Act, which most of us fall under ADA. If you have 15 or more employees, federal mandate. Certain states have a lower requirement. For example, I believe Tennessee is 2 employees. We all qualify under ADA, which means if I have somebody that cannot meet the essential standards of the job because of a physical or mental disability, I have to look at what I call a reasonable accommodation. And if I have a solid job description that I know what's essential versus non-essential to do the job, it makes that process much easier for the accommodation. So have a good job description. I like what I call criteria-based job descriptions. It serves as both the performance evaluation and the job description all in one. They're a great tool for orientation, for training, and for documenting performance issues, good and bad, successes and challenges. And the performance appraisal process itself then is truly based on the degree to which the employee is performing those specific functions of the job that's assigned. Not going to lie to you, they can get a little bit lengthy, which is why some employers don't particularly care for them. But they're quantitative, they're qualitative, and they hit everything they need to hit. As I mentioned, job descriptions with ADA, it tells us what functions are essential. It really does help us in preparing that ad and interviewing applicants based on the specific requirements of the job. When I'm formulating my ad, the first thing I'm going to go to is that job description and say, okay, what type of experience, what type of certification, what kind of technical knowledge do these folks need? Do they need a certain security clearance or background? Do I need to run a credit check on these folks or have, a valid driver's license? All of that should be, of course, in the job description, but it helps me develop that ad that I'm going to develop and post online in the newspaper, wherever it may be, to get those candidates. With ADA in the job description, you can use it in collective bargaining if we have union workers in our organization. It looks at current work experience of the incumbents in similar jobs and the work experience of past incumbents. That kind of sets the standard in terms of the accommodation process. So again, I really encourage you to get a job description, even if it's extremely basic in nature. Have something in writing. Make sure that with the job descriptions, your current employees sign off on them, but for that new position that you may be hiring for, the minute that they've accepted the role and we've got them in and we're getting ready to do the new hire orientation, make that job description a piece of the orientation. And we'll touch more on that later on, but you always want to make sure that the manager and the employee have signed off on that job description. Otherwise, it's kind of a moot point, and the employee can argue that they didn't know what was required of them. When we think about recruiting, you obviously want to pick sources that are going to best hit your industry and the target group of the individuals that you're looking for. Some folks still choose to advertise in a newspaper on Sundays, and if that's what works for you, that's what works for you. I found it to be extremely expensive in the past, but again, each industry is going to be a little bit different. Regardless of whether you're advertising, whether it's a newspaper or networking or some folks advertise on Craigslist. I'm not a huge fan of that, but again, I understand we're in the service industry, and sometimes that's where people like to go and search. Online Career Builder, Monster, Indeed, those type of things. Regardless, you want to grab the reader's attention. You want to have some sort of catchphrase that automatically draws their attention to your position. You also want to make sure that you're running the ad for several consecutive days. Now, most of the online sources are going to run it for a minimum of 30 days. I'm not sure whether PHCC or even QSC rather have kind of a job board, but in the same instance, typically they run those for 30 days. You want to sell the candidates on the job. You want to tell them why we're a good company to work for. What generally the position is going to be. If you offer benefits or have competitive packages, you want to include that. The key there is to not oversell the position or the organization. All too often we create a sense of false hope or a false sense of information or culture about the organization because we get overly zealous in our ad. Make sure the ad is truly representative of the role and of the company and the culture. My other pet peeve that I see sometimes in ads is when, number one, you run a blind ad, so you don't tell them what company they're applying for. And number two, you fail to tell people how to respond, where to send it to, how to send in that resume or that application, who to address it to, who to follow up with. So make sure we're including that information in the ad. And then you want to target your audience. Do you need specific people with certifications or certain experience levels or length of experience or technical skills? Make sure all of those are outlined in the qualification section of the ad. Verbal and written communication, mathematical skills, whatever certification, if they need a bachelor's or a trade degree, be very specific in that. And a lot of these online sources, like a Career Builder, you can set filters so it can kind of pre-screen for you, which is helpful. The other thing I would suggest that is not on this slide in terms of recruiting with the ad is to, one, make it sex neutral. Don't say I need female office staff or men in the field, whatever it may be. Make sure it's sex neutral because sex and age are protected underneath federal class. Anything over the age of 40 is a protected class. So therefore, you don't want to say, right out of college or looking for young, fresh talent, whatever it may be. Don't use those type of descriptors. Stick to the pertinent job requirements. Always include an equal opportunity reference. At the very bottom of any job that you ever post, whether it's through your Facebook page or Craigslist or online or in the newspaper, the very last thing after you've told them how to respond should be a 3 acronym, EOE, Equal Opportunity Employer. That tells them that we're not going to discriminate based on age, race, sex, religion, national origin, genetic information, disability. Certain states have additional protected classes. I know here in Virginia, marital status is a protected class. In Vermont and California, sexual preference is a protected class. So, make sure that we're not discriminating against those folks, and we've got that EOE statement. Whatever you do, do not make promises. I can't explain to you how many times I go and look online if I'm doing a sourcing or just to kind of see what's out there for some of my clients. Not that I do a whole lot of recruiting, but it's amazing to me how many employers make kind of guaranteed promises on employment in their ads, just with catchphrases like looking for long-term work or looking for career sustainability, you'll never want to leave us, those type of things. Most states are what I call at will, meaning that the employee can quit at any point in time or the employer can let that person go at any point in time with or without reason. So you never want to imply guaranteed employment or imply a contractual agreement, okay? Consider a display ad. You may pay a little bit more, but if it's bigger, it's brighter, it's catchier, tends to draw folks a little bit more to that. And again, use an open ad. All too often, folks get a little nervous if they don't know what company they're applying to, if you don't list the company name or the industry that they're in. So make sure that you're running an open ad. Recruitment sources that you may want to consider, an employee referral program. A lot of times that's great. I've heard a little bit of it all when it comes to that. Good outcomes, bad outcomes, and different outcomes. A lot of times the employee referral program is often tied to some sort of compensation or spiff or incentive if whoever they referred, joins the company and stays for a certain period of time. That is fine. Just be mindful of wage and hour, which is the federal agency that monitors compensation, wages, overtime, minimum wage, that sort of thing. Be mindful of wage and hour regulations as it relates to the employer referrals. because if I have somebody that's non-exempt that's working overtime and I give them a bonus or a commission, that commission then has to be included and recalculated into the overtime rate because it increases the total monies earned for that period of time. So be mindful of that. Another question I recently got from one of my clients was that generally they have used the employee referral program for their staff, but then also taken kind of the performance of that employee that was referred in. They used that secondary person's performance in consideration of the performance evaluation of the person that referred them. And I don't particularly agree or recommend that practice. You only want to hold, the employees accountable for their own performance and their own behavior on the job. So you also want to look at your job postings, identify where you want to post them. If you can, team up with a co-op program through a technical school or a local university, a lot of times that we can get some good interns, which turn into long-term employment. So look into partnerships that way. Government agencies, if you're using a temp service, great. Just ensure that whoever is doing your placements, that they understand the industry and they understand what truly you are looking for, the qualities and the requirements of the position. Personal networking is great, particularly in your industry. So, use that. But again, there are requirements in terms of how long we have to keep applications and resumes on file. So, be careful about how many sources we have in the influx of information we're getting. Speaking engagements could be good, internet, and then job fairs, of course, are good recruitment sources. Screening tools you absolutely want to use. You need an application for employment. If I'm going to consider you for an interview or for employment, you've got to fill out the application, and it needs to be completed 100%. I do a lot of auditing of client files, and every so often I'll come across one where somebody will have submitted their resume and they filled out maybe the top section of the application and then wrote over the rest of the application, see resume for rest of experience, and then signed off on it. And that's just not going to cut it in terms of your protection for a variety of employment laws. Make sure that application is completed 100% and it's been signed by the individual, because once it has been signed, it becomes a legal document. So hypothetically speaking, if I find out through the reference and background checks that this person lied on the application, or I find out after the fact that something was not truthful in the application, I am within my legal right to immediately terminate that person because of their dishonesty on the application. So have a good application of employment. We'll talk more about that. The interview process can get lengthy, but we'll cover that. Definitely want to do reference checks and background checks, particularly for your industry, as many of you may be doing federal bids for work, and then assessment tests. Whether it be skills tests, personality tests, there's a variety of things that you can look at for that. What to look for on the application or the resume. Things you want to be mindful of. The wages earned. You all are going to know right off the bat, generally, how much you can afford to pay this position. So what I'm going to be looking for on the application is their compensation history. Have they been earning within relatively a close range to what I'm going to pay, or are they completely skewed one direction or the other? If they're making $9 an hour and I know I'm going to pay $12, are they really the most qualified? Do they have the skill set and can I justify bumping them up that much? On the reverse side of that, if I know I'm only going to pay $12, am I really going to bring in somebody that's currently making $16 or $17 an hour? Are they going to be willing to make that jump and take a significant pay cut? So just look at the wages earned and see how they fall in with your compensation section. You also want to look at the education piece. What type of education, again, is required for the position, and do they have that education? And be mindful for buzzwords, too. Just because I attended a certain school or college does not mean that I graduated. So you want to look for those graduation dates. Personal references. Each application should have a space for at least 3 personal references and 3 professional references. My philosophy has always been if they cannot provide you with at least 3 personal references, there might be a problem here. We may not want to consider them moving forward for that role. So look for the personal references. Also be mindful of employment dates. Are they currently employed? And if they haven't been or if they're not currently employed, you want to delve a little bit further. What have they been doing during their time off? Have they, remained active in the industry and keeping up to date with what's going on or technical changes that may have happened in their skill set? So look for employment dates. You also want to be mindful of, are those dates consistent and consecutive? I don't particularly care when somebody just gives me a general year. I really want to look for a month and a year and look to see if there's gaps between those months. You also want to look at the reasons for leaving past jobs. Hypothetically speaking, we all, quote, unquote, leave for a better opportunity. But again, I want to dig into that. I want to know, why did you leave? Was it because you and the management or the culture of the organization weren't a good fit? Was it because you were leaving for more money or better benefits or better hours, whatever the reason was? Dig into that. You're going to want to look for job progression. Has this person continued to grow personally and professionally? Have they gained skill sets, knowledge, experience, those type of things? And then your criminal record. Now, here's where you have to be careful. On the application, it is perfectly fine to ask, have you been convicted of a misdemeanor, a felony, etc. What you cannot ask is about arrest records. It's an invalid moot point. All I can look at is your conviction record. And even then, I can't use those convictions against you unless it's directly related to the position that you're going to be doing. Okay? So if you have that question on your application, make sure that it's worded correctly and legally. Things to look for in terms of red flags on applications. Like I mentioned, rounded off dates, general years should be a red flag. You want to know, when did they start and stop in these positions or with these companies? Again, non-specific educational information. I want to see that you graduated. Reasons for leaving past jobs, more money, better benefits, I hated my manager, whatever it may be, dig into that. Something that should red flag you could be a lack of salary progression. Now, that's a double-edged sword there. It could be that I have been so great in the position, but unfortunately due to economy, due to compensation, budget, that sort of thing, the company cannot afford to give me any more money for that position. And I kind of capped out, or maxed out rather, in that role, and there's nowhere else for me to go. Or it could also be that they're not such a great performer, and they didn't warrant getting an increase in compensation. So be mindful of that. Again, dig into those type of things and look into that. Same concept goes with lack of progression in duties and responsibilities. Have I maxed out in that role, or did I just not have the drive, the effort, or the skill set to really continue to grow and develop? Gaps in employment history, as I mentioned, you want to look into what have they been doing in the lag time. Have they been going, to industry-specific meetings, networking, those sort of things. Figure out what they've been doing in the meantime. And also be mindful of overly vague or general job duties and titles. Just because I handled paperwork does not mean that I processed paperwork. It could be that I merely picked it up from one person's desk and transferred it to another person's desk without actually processing it. So just be mindful of those overly vague descriptions. I particularly like to use what I call a behavioral-based interview. And that's basically using past behavior as the best predictor of future behavior. What it allows us to do is obtain really specific skill sets for the job, develop questions based around those skills, and conduct an interview that is more engaging. It allows us to look at, how have they handled certain situations and examples in the past. And then I can also probe for specifics if they don't give me what I'm looking for. For example, tell me about a time when you did substandard work and the customer or the client complained and you had to go back and fix it. What did you learn from the situation? How did you fix the work? What remedies did you take? And how did you, use your learning experience to negate things like that happening in the future? Okay, so those type of questions. Tell me about a time when. How have you handled X, Y, and Z? Describe to me a situation where. Generally gives us a better look at them, how they, handle their technical skills, their soft skills that are directly related to the position. What it does not allow us to do is make first impression judgments. We're human. Most of us make our judgments, our impressions within the first 30 seconds, whether it's in person or talking to somebody over the telephone. So if behavioral-based interviewing is set up correctly, it doesn't allow us to kind of make snap judgments. It also doesn't allow us to do all of the talking. In interviews, the candidate should be doing 80% of the talking. Okay, I, as the interviewer, should only be doing about 20%. And that's asking the questions and digging for specifics. If I've formulated good questions, that the 80-20 rule should not be a problem. It doesn't allow us to lead candidates or take one-word answers or make our decisions based on subjective criteria. It also keeps us out of trouble in terms of EEO, equal employment opportunity, with the race, sex, religion, color, national origin, age, those type of things, okay? So it doesn't allow us to kind of walk down that path with asking illegal questions. As I mentioned, there's some steps in behavioral interviewing, and the first one is completing your skills analysis. That's why it's really helpful to have a job description so that you know exactly what skill set you're looking for. So you can ultimately take that job description, say, I need somebody that's got math proficiency, written communications, team player, whatever it may be, and I can develop my questions around that. Making sure that they're open-ended and that they focus on those skill sets. Then you want to conduct the interview, have a really good listening session, whether it's you in the interview room with the person, or maybe we have a couple folks in there with us. Make sure that we're actively listening. We've put away the iPhones. We've put away the laptops and the tablets. And we're focusing on that individual. You want to evaluate the behavior by taking really good notes. You want to, focus on your intuition, of course, because I do think there's value in going with your gut. But you always want to seek what I call contrary evidence. So you never just ask candidates for all good examples or all bad examples. You want to ask them a good example of each skill set. So tell me about a time when you had a good experience, and now tell me about a time when you didn't do so well, because that allows us to have a very neutral perception of the individual. After you've gone through and evaluated the behavior, of course, you want to make your hiring decision, whether you do that by yourself or with a team. I enjoy having teams involved, or at least having a couple of different folks interview them through different rounds, because all too often, what I hear may not be necessarily what others hear, or what others interpreted that I interpreted. We also tend naturally to hire folks that have similar personality styles to ourselves. So we want to make sure that we're not letting ourselves be biased or skewed in any way. When you conduct an interview, you want to start off by building rapport. Have, the standard greeting, thanks for coming in, I appreciate your time, how was your drive-in, wherever, the common courtesies. You want to put the person at ease, but you also don't want to, again, oversell the situation where we're setting them up to think that this is going to be easy breezy, in and out, we're just going to kick back. But if that's the style and the approach that you take to your interview, that's fine. But build a rapport, make sure it's representative and reflective of how you want the interview to go. You want to control the interview. The worst, there's nothing more intolerable than some of those folks with big personalities that take over the interview, and before you know it, they're asking you questions and you know nothing about them. So make sure that you control the interview, and I do that by, after I've gone through the common courtesies, I kind of say, I appreciate you coming in. What I want to talk to you about is how this process is going to work for the next 30 minutes or an hour, however long it may be. I'm going to ask you some behavioral-based questions, and I'm going to ask you that you answer those to the best of your ability. Then what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more about the position itself, and then allow you to ask questions, and then we'll wrap up and discuss the next steps. And the reason I do the interview questions first before I tell them about the position is I don't want to allow the potential candidate to skew their responses based on everything I just described to them about what I'm looking for. All too often we tell them, well, I need somebody that's X, Y, and Z in terms of soft skills, and they need to have this and that, and this is what the culture is like, and this is the personalities of the management team or your supervisor or whomever. And I pretty much just handed them the position on a silver platter, because now they're going to tailor their responses, their attitude, their communication style to exactly what I just described. So make sure you're telling them about the company, about the position, after you have asked your initial questions. Ask those open-ended questions that focus on your behavior. Tolerate their interview silence. I know that that's challenging because it's awkward for many, many people, myself included, but often that can encourage them to give you more information. If I'm writing down, a candidate's response, and I just kind of look up and nod, and then I'm silent for 20 or 30 seconds. A lot of times those people will begin to talk again, because that's their cue. Either I'm dissatisfied with what I've heard, or you didn't quite answer the question you didn't answer the question the way that you should have. So I'm going to give you more information. So tolerate that interview silence as best as you can. Take extremely descriptive notes, but be careful about what you write down. There are a number of employment regulations that are on the books in terms of, like I said, EEO, age, race, sex, religion, national origin, those type of things. Number one, we can't ask those questions related to those. And number two, if somebody starts talking about their children or their church or, their disability or challenge that they have, if they bring that up to us, fine. That's great. Whatever you do, do not write it down. You also never want to write on the application. That is a huge no-no. Write on a sticky note, write on a separate piece of paper, but never physically write on the resume or the application. If we were to hypothetically hire that individual and they were to file a formal complaint through any of the federal agencies, and their personnel file was subpoenaed with their application, and there was something questionable written down from the interview, we're not going to be able to defend that. So make sure that you're always taking notes on separate pieces of paper. Always seek that contrary information, seek behavioral examples, and be prepared to answer those questions yourself about pay, benefits, culture, who the manager would be, what the organizational structure is. Be ready for those things also. What you also want to do is conduct your reference checks. Whatever you do, do not delay. All too often I find that employers fail to do reference checks. and if they had taken the time to do the reference checks up front, they probably wouldn't have hired half of the people that they did that turned out to be bad employees. So don't delay. Do those before you also bring that person in to start work. It's much easier to decline the employment offer before they've completed their I-9 form and we've entered them into payroll and those sort of things. Be mindful of cautious of written references that are handed directly to you. With the technology these days, anything can be photoshopped. So if we're going to have handwritten references, fine, but it needs to be in a sealed envelope, and you may even still want to call and verify that the reference that was given was factual and accurate. In terms of speaking with former supervisors, that's going to be your key. If you can get the name of the supervisor and get them on the line and speak to them, quote unquote, off the record, that's what you're going to want to do. If you call HR or the office manager, generally all you're going to get from them is dates of employment, maybe the title or the position that they held, and if you're lucky, are they eligible for rehire or not? And that's just the way that, you know, the industry, all industries have moved to over the years, just because everything is so litigious lately, with former employees filing, you know, wrongful terminations or defamation claims or whatever it may be. So HR individuals and office managers are a little less apt to give you more information on their performance and their attendance and that sort of thing. But if you can get in touch with the supervisor and even ask them off the record, sometimes, and more often than not, they'll give you kind of more information. Also, you know, if you ask the question of, are they eligible for rehire, yes or no, and somebody says no, that should probably be a big red flag for you. Now, of course, that could be, you know, a number of reasons. It could be that they haven't passed the drug test, that they haven't, they had poor attendance or bad performance, or that, you know, it just, they went through something personal and it came through. So you just never know, but it should also be a red flag. Call most, if not all, of the former employers that are listed on that resume or application. Don't just stop after you get one good reference. If possible, get those references by phone, write them down. Again, be very mindful about what you write down, so that we're not writing down anything that's discriminatory in nature, and make sure those go into the personnel file as well. Background investigations, I feel, are extremely important, regardless of what type of role that person holds, whether they're a field worker, whether they're an office staff. Generally, 33% of all job applicants falsify their employment applications or their resumes. They pad them, they lie about how much money they were making or the duties that they did. Heck, I've even interviewed folks that just lied flat out about working for a company, and these were individuals for managerial roles. So you always want to do the background, particularly the references. And you also want to do backgrounds not only for your local municipality or your state, but do a nationwide search. You know, if they have charges from other states and you're only running your state police report, those things aren't going to pop up. So make sure you're doing an nationwide search. Roughly $15 to $25 billion a year is lost on employee theft. And that's due to making bad hires or not checking backgrounds and references appropriately. So do your due diligence. And 3.2 million crimes and thefts each year tend to happen in the workplace. And that's a scary number. Part of doing background checks is that we do have to comply with what I call the Fair Credit Reporting Act. We have to make a clear and written disclosure to the applicant that we're going to be checking credit or background or what have you, and they have to give us their written authorization to do so. Some employers have that authorization automatically grouped in with the application, and it's a certain paragraph that they read and initial and sign, while others do a separate authorization form at the time of conditional employment offer. And that's generally what I prefer, to do the separate authorization, but certainly find something that works for you. You'll have to use, and you have to certify that the credit reporting agency that we're using, you know, has the information, and they're not going to violate any federal law, of course, or equal employment law, state or federal, that applies to EEO. And then we also have to certify and let these folks know under Fair Credit Reporting Act that if we're going to be using that information in our hiring decision, and let's just say I run your background report and it pops up with 10 felony convictions, and I'm using that against you in my decision, and I say, not going to hire you. I have to let you know that is the reason why I did not hire you. And here's a copy of your report. And if you think something is inaccurate in this report, then here are the steps that you need to take to rectify that. And that is part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act requirements, and the Consumer Reporting Agency should do that for you. If you're using a state police, they do not provide those folks with that notice, so you'll have to do that for yourself. Again, things you're going to need from the employee, the potential candidate: name, address, telephone number for the agency that we're using, and that the agency themselves did not make the decision whether or not the adverse action was taken. They have, like I mentioned, the right to request a copy of their credit report, or we have the right to request a credit report within 60 days. And they can dispute that directly as well. Do background checks. I really encourage you to do them. I know that they at times can be expensive, and they can have a little bit longer turnaround time. There are a ton of different companies out there. Make sure you're using a reputable organization. If you have questions about that, certainly feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can walk through some of those that I prefer to use. But do your backgrounds and do your references. Another thing you may want to consider is testing of applicants using agility tests. You know, whether it be mathematical or technical skills or cognitive reasoning, make sure that you're testing items that come very close to the content of the job in terms of the requirements. You also want to be mindful, though, that some people just don't test well. So high test scores may be significant, and low test scores may or may not be meaningful. You know, it could be that I don't test well, or I have a mental disability as I'm taking the test, which I may have to do a reasonable accommodation for. Recognize that each test, regardless of what type it is, may have some limitations. Don't misuse them either. Don't make them the end-all, be-all as to whether I hire this person or not. I often like to do, particularly for managers, what I call DISC personality profile testing. And I know that it's a good resource, and it's an additional layer of, you know, looking at those person and their qualities and characteristics. But I also know that, you know, there are exceptions to the rule, and that I can't use this test as my kind of determining factor on whether or not this person's going to make it or break it. You also want to make sure that if you're using a test, that it's standard and reliable. Don't just create your own mathematical test or your own reasoning or customer service test. Make sure that it's standard, it's valid and reliable, and it comes from a company that specializes in pre-employment testing. If you have questions about it, I've got roughly about 300 different types of pre-employment tests that SESCO can put you in touch with for any type position. Another thing that I really encourage you all to do, particularly for workers' comp purposes, your drug tests and your physical exams. And they have to be done. You can do them pre-employment or post-employment physicals, particularly in your industry because you've got extreme working conditions and physical demands, potential dangers, those sort of things. But if you're going to do a pre-employment physical or drug test, it needs to go along with a conditional offer of employment. Okay? Your employment here, we're offering you this position upon successful completion of reference, background, drug test, whatever it may be. Okay, so make sure that the conditional offer of employment is there first. Generally, folks that do pre-employment drug screens tend to save a little bit more money in the up front before we kind of bring those folks on. And those folks then have, workers' comp accidents or OSHA violations or whatnot. So you've gone through this process again. It's long. Make sure you've got good documentation, good processes, and we're ready to make the offer. You can do it verbally or in writing. I do encourage you to put something in writing, even if it's not a formal letter, but have something typed up for the file so that it's easy, should they ever be subpoenaed for whatever reason, to know what position I offer this position, where is it going to be located, what type of compensation, salary, hourly, any benefits they're eligible for, and when, and the start date of that individual. If they have information that they need to bring on the first day of work, such as identification for the I-9, copies of documents for the I-9, if we're going to do direct deposit, do they need to bring a blank check, those type of things. And if they haven't given you an answer, if they're going to take the job or not, make sure that you give them a date that they need to respond to you by. Okay. You also want to challenge your new hire orientation process. I like what I call a buddy system, pairing them up with a supervisor or a superstar, rather, one of your high performers for, the first couple weeks to show them the ropes. You also want to be mindful that first impressions really do last a lifetime. Take the time with them to go through the handbook. Take the time with them to show them how to clock in, how to clock out, where the coffee is, where to submit time cards, whatever the specifics for the office are, or even in the field, show them how to do that. Pair them up with somebody. Make sure that the supervisor is checking in on them and showing them the correct way to do things per your company, because studies have proven that folks that are just tossed into the organization that don't have a solid or a strong orientation process, they're generally gone within the first 60 to 90 days, okay? So develop an employee on-the-job training system, whether that be through the first quarter, the first year, particularly for new folks. If you want an orientation checklist, please email me. I'm happy to send that over to you. I've got many samples. All in all, screening and hiring can be a daunting task and frustrating from a variety of perspectives because you spend a lot of time and go through this process, and ultimately you still could possibly make a bad hire. But if we have good processes, good policies in place, and good questions to ask, it helps negate the probability of us making a bad hire, and it puts us in a better place to be more successful. So if you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer those. It does not look to me like we have anything through the chat function or the question function. But I do want to reiterate, look for certain things on the resume, have a good application, have a job description, and have really solid questions. If you need samples of behavioral-based questions, I'd be happy to send those out to you if you want to reach out to me. My email address is Jamie, Jamie, at SESCO, SESCOMGT.com. Feel free to email me, or you can call us directly at 423-764-4127. Myself or any of the other senior consultants would be happy to assist you in screening and hiring questions or any other HR things. So with that being said, I want to thank you all for your valued time this afternoon.